Now we are here.
We are
I
here.
I am
That is
Zach.
Zach over there.
That's yep. I don't have I don't have my self view on for myself, so it's
Oh,
just you on my screen. So you pointed over here. I'm like, I am
right.
over
I'm
there.
just looking at you, not at all at me. Split
Yeah.
screen at all.
No, I usually do that, but then I find that I am looking at myself so much more, So I don't know. In some
That's
situations, I
true.
just, especially if I'm going to sit and talk for an hour, I'm like, I don't
Well,
want to
plus
bring it
you're
up.
also, and we're always looking at the monitor instead of me looking at the camera like
I
this, which
know.
gets really creepy if I'm
I
just
know,
like, I'm
I know.
staring into your soul, the
Yeah.
whole time.
Anyway, you're Greg, by the way.
You're Zach.
So yeah.
So hi Zach.
Hey.
How's tricks? I got questions for you. You got questions for me.
Yeah, yeah. I thought it was rather poignant that you said that now you're getting over a cold when the last time that we recorded, I was getting over a cold
Yep.
from BlizzCon. So now
Yep. Yeah,
you from
courtesy of my
PAX Unplugged,
son.
but
So
yeah.
many thanks to my son. But no, it's he got better pretty quickly, and I should be back to normal. But I was walking around PAX Unplugged, down, which is appropriate for this show. I was walking around PAX Unplugged, and I was just kind of like, ugh, like,
Uh,
not feeling super great. But all getting better, feeling much better today. So
yeah. So last time we started with me asking you a question. So why don't we start with you asking
okay.
me?
All right, I got a question for you, and
Okay,
I've decided to start small by
great.
asking you about the future of our hobby.
Let's do
Um,
it.
so let's make it happen. So I have three books for you.
Oh wow.
So I've got this one, which you of course heard about, which is John
Mm-hmm.
Harper's Blades in the Dark,
Yeah.
right? Which is the Forged in the Dark system. I have this one, which is the Beowulf Age of Heroes handiwork game system. It's a duet
Cool.
system, but it's 5e. It's based on 5th edition.
Oh,
I'm going to be launching one of those in December, full disclosure on my channel.
yeah.
And then I have this, which our mutual friend Dot, who's the marketing director for Kobold Press, was nice enough to give me this weekend and at PAX Unplugged, and that's this, which
Wow.
is Kobold Press's Tales of the Valiant. It's their alpha release, and this is their new RPG system that is based on the OGL, and it is 5th edition compliant, but it's also supposed to be its own thing. So here's the question that I have for you. I walked around PAX Unplugged in Philadelphia where there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and there were hundreds of booths and many games that were being described about different things. There was the OGL debacle from earlier in 2023, where there were all these issues with Wizards and with Dungeons and Dragons specifically, and what's going to happen and so on. And
Yeah.
even if the specific debate around that has settled down, there's still the discussion of, are there going to be competitors like Paizo's Pathfinder was for 4th edition? Are we going to get something like that for 5th edition? So what I want to ask you is, do you think we are going to move in the direction of this, more forged in the dark, more powered by the apocalypse, more fate
Mm-hmm.
core, more systems that are not 5th edition at all? Are we going to be moving away from that sort of thing, or do we think that these things, 5th edition direct like Beowulf, or 5th edition adjacent? And I got to be honest, I spent a fair bit of time yesterday after I got back from work looking this over. This is a lot like 5th edition, like a lot. There are some changes and some tweaks and some interesting mechanics and so on that are different, but a lot of it feels like I'm just reading more 5th edition, which is fine. I like 5th edition. But I'm wondering if we're going to see more of these things that are either tweaking the model or are trying to do their own thing, but really just kind of reinventing the wheel with 5th edition, or are we going to get more of this stuff going forward, which is substantively different? I guess I'm asking you, Zach, are we witnessing the end of history when it comes to editions? That's what
Well, luckily, I took 20 levels in Divination Wizard, so I can answer this question.
Outstanding.
And the answer is I don't know.
Well,
I'll
damn it.
say I can tell you what my opinion is on that on those
Okay.
three systems. I'm glad that you came with some examples because that helps. But first off, I think the I personally, as much as I love D&D, and love fifth edition, and hopefully will love where they're taking the edition from now on, you know, with their lead designers.
Right.
I don't want D&D to have a monopoly over the tabletop space.
Agree.
I have never played Blades in the Dark, but I have played, actually, you showing these games actually reminded me that I just had an unopened copy of a game that I played at Big Bad Con a couple months
Okay.
ago, which is this cyberpunk augmented module by MythWorks.
Interesting.
And this uses the Forged in the Dark system,
Okay.
D6 system with, you know, successes based on the highest die that you roll of the pool that you roll, so on.
Yep.
A lot like Citizen Sleeper, so on, with clocks and all that.
Well, and Citizen Sleeper, you know, was like heavily influenced by Blades in the Dark too.
Right. Yeah.
So that,
Well,
yeah.
I think from what I read, Blades in the Dark is Blades in the Dark, but then Blades in the Dark's OGL
Right.
design
That's
is
right.
called Forged in the Dark,
That's
which
right.
I
That's
think
right. Yep.
Citizen Sleeper kind of uses. Anyway,
That's
this
right.
uses Forged in the Dark. The point being, my opinion, my desire for the future, at least, and then I guess after saying that, maybe it'll lead to what I think will happen. But I would love to see more distinct systems that find a way to express something that hasn't been expressed in the tabletop space, like Blades in the Dark has been able to do. I would love to see more of that, personally. And like I tried, then you have the variations on those systems that happen. You know, this is the Beowulf to the fifth edition. This is the Tales or the
Yep.
Kobold Press book that you just showed, right, to that.
Yep. Yep.
And I think it's a good thing in the sense that for someone who's really into Beowulf or into that genre that Beowulf evokes, or maybe the classes that come with the Beowulf book, or I get to play as what's the sort of Gollum character from Beowulf? Is it Grendel? Is that
Grendel.
what, yeah. You
Grendel.
know,
Yeah.
maybe you get to play as Grendel in the Beowulf RPG. I don't know. And I did a school project on Beowulf in college. So I don't know. That'd be cool. But ultimately, I mean, as you were just saying, and this Kobold Press book is, of course, one of many examples. One of the prime ones being Pathfinder, being a very famous sort of offshoot of D&D, right?
Yep.
Um, I don't know. On one hand, like, do I think that there will just be these infinite iterations of fifth edition? I think their use and the benefits of them, like I've said, is if there's a particular kind of genre or uh, style or fantasy that they evoke, like Beowulf. The thematic Beowulf one I think is cool. But to be honest with you, I don't. Uh, for a lot of those systems where they're not known IP like Beowulf, or this isn't like the Star Wars 5e. This isn't this 5e. It's just here's my fantasy world, but it's not D&D. Here's we're using its OGL or it's very similar.
Right.
There's going to be so many of those next year, and I'm kind of worried, honestly, that there are going to be many iterations that are very close to fifth edition that maybe a handful of things they do better, but ultimately we still have fifth edition. The OGL debacle has sort of rounded out. We'll see how the new edition of Dungeons and Dragons itself works out, but
Right.
assuming it does with
Right.
player feedback and testing, then that'll still be around. And D&D Beyond too, as a note, has started to, for the first time. I mean, of course we have the DMs Guild, but D&D Beyond has started to upload digital versions of third-party products now. So that started with Critical Role, of course, but they actually have two products from two different creators or two different publishers, which honestly could easily be Kobold Press, that are on D&D Beyond right now. So Ghostfire Gaming has an entire module that you can now run through D&D Beyond that Dungeons and Dragons is officially posted on there. Like I have it as part of my account now. And then Dungeons of Drakkenheim, published by the Dungeon Dudes, that is now going to be on D&D Beyond, just like any of D&D's official products. So now even more than ever, now that they're, I mean, I guess I didn't even think until recently because this just happened about the ramifications of that. Of not, that now means that they are publishing. I mean, a year ago we were so worried about the OGL closing in so tightly that third party material would basically be impossible. But now here we are, and there are three different companies of third party material that's on their official site. So,
Like they went in the opposite direction. Yeah. And by the way, just quick note, Roll20, I don't know if you saw this, but Roll20 now has started basically developing their character creator and scaling it such that you'll be able to basically make it be able to use it portably in a different way than was the case before. Plus, they're redesigning the sort of underlying engine of Roll20, which suggests to me that there are
mm,
also virtual tabletop wars on the horizon, and that whether D&D Beyond plays into that, Roll20 is going to start tapping in a little bit into the D&D Beyond space of sort of character development online, in the same way that I think D&D Beyond and especially WotC is going to want to start tapping into the virtual table space. So anyway, that's also going to happen. Yeah.
right. Yeah. Earlier this year or last year, I don't remember, is when D&D announced their like three-dimensional video game like
Yeah.
tabletop that they're doing.
Yeah.
Still crickets on that. But D&D has actually already released an alpha of a Roll20 virtual tabletop like copy. I don't want to call it a copy, but it's a two-dimensional tabletop that you can already use on D&D Beyond. It is uh, catching up to every feature that something like Roll20 or Foundry already offers. So it's pretty obsolete at this point, if especially if you're a user of one of the existing ones. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think that's right too. Anyway, I realized I didn't really answer your question, but the idea of what I think the state will be next year, I don't know. I think as much as I don't like supporting massive capitalist companies on one hand, and as much as I love the people at Wizards and some of the people that I know there, they're a big company. Hasbro's a ginormous company. I love supporting the little guy, the idea of that, but there's also the cultural impact that Dungeons and Dragons as a brand has, the movie Baldur's Gate 3, which is, I will just go ahead and say, about to be the game of the year. I'll
Yeah.
if
I
I'm
don't see how
refuted
it
on that,
misses.
but
I haven't even played it, and I don't see how it misses
yeah.
it.
So with that being said, I really don't think D&D is going anywhere. And personally, I don't want it to go anywhere. I think as long as we as a community continue to give them feedback, and as long as they listen, if it starts going down that road where it happened with the OGL again, then yeah, maybe there is a world out there where it does finally fall apart, but they realize they completely veered back onto the road
Yeah.
after that
Yeah.
happened. So anyway, yeah, next year I will certainly be open and curious to try 5e compliant or like 5e not agnostic, but 5e similar systems and stuff like that. But if there's not something that is specific to its fantasy or game changing on top of 5e, then why wouldn't I just play 5e? Blades in the Dark, though, systems that are entirely different, I would love more of those. I want
Yeah.
more of those. I want systems where I don't have to spend an hour on character creation, or sorry,
Yeah.
probably in D&D more than an hour. That's something I love about this. This was one of the quickest and most satisfying games I've ever played. And I've started running it for my high schoolers because it's just a D6 system. Character creation takes 5 minutes, and bam, we're ready to go. And so I would love more of that. I think if there's a way that we can support the kind of game that D&D is, and working around the plights of the company that is behind it, I would love to see that perfect world. I don't think we're living in it right now, but we're
No.
trying. But then also the shortcomings of D&D, I want to see how that inspires more distinct separate work
Right.
from it. So yeah, I guess suppose that's my analysis of the question. I think given honestly any of the questions that we ask each other, we should also ask each other. So what's your opinion on that whole
Yeah.
situation, especially coming from that convention where you saw a whole breadth of tabletop stuff at once.
Yeah, I mean, and full disclosure, as I've said, my Gray Shade universe is going to have the
Right.
Gray Shade tabletop role playing game, which is
Yeah.
a fifth edition system, except that it's a fifth edition system with some very different mechanics that are added.
Hmm.
Faith is not only different just as a stat in terms of how it's managed with a line, and there's a whole bunch of
Right.
stuff that we'll talk
And
about when we
I'll
get there.
I'll add about that too, that I think that that is like my Beowulf example, that that started as a novel. You know what I mean? Like if someone's
Right,
making something that's distinct to a game, an IP that's fifth edition, which I would
right.
count that as, great, let's do it. Because that brings, it's almost, I treat that as like almost either its own distinct system to play, or if you're really dependent on D&D, a DLC to D&D, great. Um,
Ye-
where
Yeah,
as
no,
opposed to
absolutely.
a system where someone just makes it and there's no other, it's just sort of sitting out there like this isn't D&D, but it is, you know.
Yeah, and that's I think one of the things that's going to be difficult. If you get something, someone was talking about some of these 5e systems feeling very like kind of like dollar store knockoffs, right? Like or things where you're just like it's just like the original, but it's this and you're like, it's then why wouldn't I just play the original as you said, right? The interesting thing is going to be to me whether or not some of these systems that have been developed in parallel whether people still feel the need to do that. So the example that I would give for this is I just wrapped up the Shire Adventures campaign that was sponsored on my channel by Free League. And that originally came from Cubicle 7 had that license, and I had been sponsored by them for Adventures of Middle Earth. It was a 5e based system. But the original system that Cubicle 7 did was the One Ring, right? Which was its own separate system. It had a lot of the same sort of thematic feel because it's still Tolkien and still Middle Earth, but a very different kind of mechanical system to reach that same end. And then they made this fifth edition compatible version, which was also very popular and very successful. And so Shire Adventures is a 5e adventure, 5e compatible based system.
Hmm.
And they're going to do the same thing eventually with the entire version of sort of transferring over the One Ring stuff to this. So they have the One Ring and they have Return to Moria and they have all these things. And they've been
Wow.
doing the One Ring stuff first. And then, and I don't know what the lag time is off the top of my head, but let's say 6 months to a year later is when they start talking about doing the 5e compatible versions of this. My question is, will they feel the need to continue to do that? Or will there be enough people that will sort of jump over and be like, I don't need a fifth edition version of this thing. I just need this thing. So I'm playing a Talisman Adventures campaign. I just ran a session of that over on GOG.com's Twitch channel earlier today. That is its own system. It is not D&D based. It is not, it is very sort of oriented, if anything, around the Talisman board game. And so there's a lot of aspects that would sort of remind people about that who grew up with that. It's a very different kind of system. I don't see any reason whatsoever to make a Talisman Adventures 5th edition thing. And it's not going to get one because it's not popular enough as a system, as a concept for people to be like, oh my God, right? It's not something where Beowulf is hugely popular, so people want that. Or, I could see a scenario where Game of Thrones could eventually be made
Yeah,
into a 5th edition thing
of
because it's
course.
just so popular. So that all makes sense. Talisman is not going to have that because it's not as popular to get to that stage. But the point is, if we get to the point where people are like, you know what, I don't mind learning this system, and we've streamlined it enough that I want to be able to just learn that system, and I don't need to worry about finding the 5th edition version of this, that is when I think you're going to see things change in an interesting way, because then you are going to be putting all of the 5e weight on D&D itself and D&D the game and the Forgotten Realms and maybe Eberron and the stuff that's direct, Spelljammer and Planescape, all the stuff
Mm.
that's directly associated with the D&D world. But in terms of the mechanics, the 5th edition stuff may go by the wayside. I don't know because 5th edition is, I think, in so many ways easy to pick up. I think it sort of fits with a lot of people, and it's also the stuff that Critical Role has been doing a lot of, and so people are kind of familiar to watching it through that. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but if it ever does, where we don't have these systems in parallel, but we have systems that are just sort of standing out there on their own, then that's
Mm.
going to be a different thing. I mean, Blades in the Dark, of all the ones that I showed you before, Blades in the Dark is the one that is most distinctively different than any of the ones before.
Yeah.
Like this, as I said, has some cool tweaks and mechanics. It's very 5e, as I said,
Hmm.
like it's very 5th edition driven. And the Beowulf one is intended to be. I mean, they say that it is a 5e based system. It has
Right.
a lot of things that it does differently, much differently even than the Tales of the Valiant does. There's a follower system in here. There's a whole system in terms of like ships and crew and how one customizes ships and stuff that's important and thematic to the place. And the themes and adventures and the characters and the design make it feel like Beowulf, and that's really what
Right.
people are looking for. But regardless, still 5e, prominently listed on the
Yeah.
top of this, right? Whereas Blades in the Dark is its own distinct and very different thing. And if you play this or the 6 million variants on Blades in the Dark, you'll never mistake it for anything else. Tales in the Loop, Tales in the Loop. If you play Tales in the Loop, you will never confuse it for anything else. Kids on Bikes is basically a variant on Tales in the Loop. But the point is, you'll know based upon those systems when you're playing a system like that. And although I have not played Fate Core myself, I understand that Fate Core is sort of a similar thing. So that I think is really the key. Are they going to keep designing things in parallel, or will they leave it behind, and will we get more standalone things like this that people are really into, and not just 100 people are really into it, right? But
Yeah.
like thousands and thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands and millions of people ultimately are into it, which is what they're facing with the D&D model. So it depends on how that question gets answered. And a lot of that depends on how Wizards handles their business over the next year. And a
Right.
lot of it depends on how these other companies manage to deliver, or whether they manage to deliver, really excellent standalone products. And I'm not sure yet.
And I think too, the one of the things that you said made me think of, because I was editing our clips from our last episode, and you had mentioned Star Trek, and that reminded me of a tweet that I saw that someone said that the Orville is my favorite Star Trek series. And I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the Orville. You
Oh, sure.
you have? Okay.
Yep.
You
Yep.
haven't watched any of it, have you?
Scott McFarlane's deal. I've
Hmm.
watched a couple of episodes.
Seth
I know
MacFarlane.
what they mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And yeah, so I have watched all the Orville, and I am for it. I think the Star Trek Strange New Worlds has been really good. I've really
Well,
enjoyed
I
that.
wonder whether they didn't get pushed partly because of the Orville, because Star Trek Discovery, remember, comes out, and for the first
Mm-hmm.
couple seasons, people were like, "This doesn't feel like
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek to me at all."
Exactly.
And then Orville, I wonder if that doesn't push them to do Strange New Worlds, which is much more Star Trekky, like
Yep.
traditional Star Trekky. And
Yeah.
Discovery got it even more that way as well later on. But the point is, like, I wonder if it didn't get pushed by the Orville.
Right. Have you seen any of those?
I have seen the pilot of Strange New Worlds,
Okay.
which I liked. I also saw, I think, the pilot for Discovery. Beyond that, I haven't, because I'm just sick of paying for streaming stuff. Like,
Of
I pay
course. Yeah.
Disney, and like, oh my God, another streaming service. So like,
Yeah.
I'll admit I haven't done it for that reason. Plus just a lack of time. But I would
Yeah.
like to do it. And if so, I'd be all about Strange New Worlds, because I love the original series. I teach the original series, and I'd love to see
Yep.
stuff in that vein. But yeah, maybe the Orville push them. Maybe these ones will, like I say, will push innovation and other people to sort of try new
Exactly.
systems without yelling at people. You need to stop paying it. You need to sort of break out of your comfort zone. Like, the idea is not to yell at players. The idea is to make systems that are interesting
Yeah.
and engaging, and see whether it works,
Hmm.
so
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that I think I think you might be exactly right. I really have enjoyed Strange New Worlds, and it feels like a return to the original idea of Star Trek, but also how each Star Trek episode was like, here's the cast and crew that you love, and they're in space and they're on the Enterprise. Here is strange space alien situation
Monster of the week.
slash,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
monster of the
Yep.
week slash moral quandary for them to resolve.
Yep.
And that's a lot of what the Orville was as well. And the Orville has Star Trek all over it. I mean, it's almost an exact copy,
Yeah.
but it did it very well in its own way. And then with that sort of Seth MacFarlane comedy that you'd find in Family Guy, but in a way that makes sense in Star Trek. Like, I'm not a Family Guy guy, but
Hmm.
I enjoyed every part of the Orville. So anyway, it made me think of that, of how, like, here's a show that at the time when it came out was the best version of the thing it was copying.
Right.
Um, and then, if your theory is right, which I think it could be, it prompted then the original to go back and go return, which was a win for everyone. Not
I
only do we
wonder. I
have
mean, they'd
this,
never admit it, right? And they'd
right, of
say that it was
course.
in production for a long time,
Hmm.
maybe. But Orville was in production, it was out being released before Strange New Worlds went fully into production for sure. You know,
Yeah.
that was basically just them in Discovery at the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it could
So
be.
yeah, I think there maybe one of the benefits of this is, even if the merit of each individual 5e compliant or 5e independent product, the merit and popularity of each will be completely dependent on the market and
Yep.
pop and social media and whatever. But I think ultimately it will always, as long as D&D is around, that will always come back to D&D, and people like, well, what about this system where we have this awesome thing? Why don't we do that? And I
Yep.
think in general that will just make the whole space more healthy. And I guess the last thing I'll say about it too is, uh, the more ways that people have to play a cool IP that they want or to have fun with their friends, the better, as long as we just don't drown in them. That
Right.
that is what I'm
That's
worried
true.
about.
And
So
exactly, I would not want the hobby to get sort of like scattered and
so
split and,
saturated.
you know,
Yeah.
and well, both saturated but also split where everyone's like, you know,
Right.
two people are there's like a million systems that two people
Yeah.
would look like, right?
Exactly.
And like that was the big joke around OGL when people were putting out stuff like skydiving corgi lovers from Mars, you know, is the hot new topic of RPGs. Like, okay, man, like, you know, like, and ultimately I do want this to be something that we build together as a common community, with different variations. And it's harder when you have a million different communities as opposed to, you
Yeah.
know, more communities that can bring people together. But that said, totally agree with you. In general, we want more and bigger and more options that allows for a lot of things, you know, Coyote and Crow, things like that, that are also
Yes.
about greater aspects of representation that we haven't seen. That
100%.
also pushes D&D. Like, do we think that Radiant Citadel, right? Journeys to the Radiant Citadel, does that come out if there isn't a huge amount of push from these other companies that
Hmm.
are producing work that seems far more representative and broad, and diverse and therefore appealing? I don't see any reason that WotC goes and does that if they're not pushed to do it, because there's a market and because they're getting pushed by the overall player base,
Yeah.
and because of these other systems and other options that come out. So in that regard, I agree with you about capitalism, but to the extent that we're dealing with it for right now,
Yeah.
competition is a good thing for the consumer.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I was gonna say I often throw that phrase around like, oh, capitalism and making money and everything. But there's benefits to it too, of like, it prevents monopolies. So,
Right.
or at least it should. So
Theoretically, it ought to.
theoretically. Okay, great. Well, now it's my question for you, right? I
Yes.
got lost. We discussed back and forth very nicely on that one. So, okay, I have several. I have to think about uh one here. Okay, let's try this one. So, of all the campaigns that you've run, I guess also played in could count for this. But if you think of all the campaigns that you've run, um, my question is: have you ever noticed or felt a distinct or unique dynamic between players at that table in particular? Like, can you think of a scene or a whole campaign where it's like, wow, this combination of player A and player B in this campaign led to this scene or this moment or this dynamic throughout the campaign that was really interesting?
Yes. There have been, I mean, I will say that there have been a lot of really great groups that I've been lucky to play with as a GM or a player. I would say the example that comes to mind, that sort of stands out for me. Well, they tend to be some of this two of the same players too. So I will use the example of Curse of Strahd, which I've mentioned in here before. But the reason the Curse of Strahd is interesting and the reason that it's successful, I think, is so Curse of Strahd is, for those who are not aware of this, Curse of Strahd is a very well-known adventure path from Wizards of the Coast that was originally from a module called Ravenloft back in 1985, in which presented this main character villain known as Strahd von Zarovich, who's a vampire, and who rules his land of Barovia with an iron fist. And he is unmitigatedly evil. He spends a lot of his time feeling sorry for himself and, this whole thing, but trying to make him into a villain that's got like multiple facets. I mean, he thinks he's a bigger deal than he is part of the problem, and so everything about his sort of self-absorption colors the land of Barovia. Now, I don't like horror particularly. It's not, I think it is very, effective. It's a very legitimate genre. It's just I don't like being scared, and I just don't like horror very much.
Yeah.
So this was very much pushing the envelope for me to try it, but I did try it with a group of very experienced players, which were my Infinity and Beyond players that had played a bunch of other campaigns with me. We had just wrapped up the Tyranny of Dragons campaign, which was a sort of wide scale, epic fight against dragons and things like that. And there was, they ended up at like level 13 or 14, and I would eventually return to that campaign and they'd end up at like level 16 before all was said and done. So it's a big kind of epic sweep type of stuff, which is sort of my wheelhouse. That's my bread and butter. I love that kind of stuff. But I wanted to try something which would be a little bit smaller in scale and that would be more character focused and that would push the limits. Because the thing about the Strahd stuff is that while in Barovia, which it's very difficult to escape from, the player characters have strain and stress because of the twisted, bizarre nature of the land, soulless children and wild experiments on creatures without their consent, and all kinds of lines and veils and safety tools work you have to do sort of leading into this, by the way.
Yeah.
And it was very uncertain how it was going to work, but the chemistry of that group handled it really, really beautifully. And in particular, I would say there were two players who could sometimes get on each other's nerves a bit. And that was Tren Sparks, who is, of course, a former voice person with my AR vocalist team that Zac is a member of right now, but also and a wonderful role player, and Rob, who was also voice guy and a voice actor guy, Darkside Rob. And those two definitely had some friction over the years in their play. Their characters also had this friction, and the thing that the friction, existed to a point, but then really sort of blossomed into this sort of deeply felt friendship. And there's this sequence where they go into this cave, and the character played by Tren, his beloved had basically, and his mentor had basically been killed by this werewolf. And
Mm.
in the story, when he actually runs across these werewolves and they do this whole big attack thing, he basically gets to get his revenge upon them. And he does it by essentially setting up this wall of water, locking them into a cave, and then just basically running them on spin cycle as they drown.
Wow.
And just sort of watching with this big smile on his face. The interesting thing to me was the Rob's character's take on that was a kind of an understanding of what it felt like for this other person's character to go through that, and to sort of experience it with him. And it's going to sound weird, like it's so delightful that they got to watch revenge together, but in the
Mm.
context of this very twisted and difficult land, the idea that these two characters could come to some sort of common understanding, when they would almost as characters have come to blows earlier in that game, was really, really striking. It's not the kind of campaign you could do as a 101 thing. It's not the first thing you want to introduce people to. It's not, it's not an introductory level thing. But man, the depth of role play that came out of that, and that came out of those players who in other campaigns had also been able to really get some big stuff out of each other in terms of the way the play managed.
Mm.
Having this one terrible incident happen in a tavern room, and having the character come out and talk to the other player's character about, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how to go on and handle this. And the other person's character responding to that, you hold on with your fingernails because it's all you can do, because it's all that life permits you to do. Like just gold, right? Like tremendous role play. And that wasn't anything that I pushed. The only thing that I did was set up a scenario where they were going to be stretched and strained by this fundamentally twisted evil backdrop of the setting that they were in the case of Strahd, but that their common humanity, if you will, their common desire to sustain themselves against Strahd's narcissistic self-absorption, good has friends, evil has servants, right, is the old saw.
Yeah.
That was so much in evidence that I will not likely ever forget that. There's been lots of wonderful campaigns and wonderful chemistry with so many of my campaigns. But man, the depth to which these players and others within that group were able to push each other to get to new limits collectively, that was wild. So, yeah, I would say Curse of Strahd would have been the one that I would have sort of highlighted as the one that really pushed everybody into an even greater chemistry with each other.
Yeah. And it sounds like something that I'm realizing more and more too, that I feel evoked from what you said, is that D&D at its best is a really satisfying game that also is a lens into the human experience.
Oh yeah.
And the purpose of it at its in its most perfect form, I believe, is to challenge your humanity and to help you grow
That's
as a
exactly
human,
right.
you know?
That's exactly
So
right.
that sounds like exactly the kind of thing that happened.
It's
I
exactly right, and it was a good lesson for as a GM to think about out there for folks watching the show
yeah,
is to challenge yourself as a DM. You know, as a game master, you have to challenge yourself, and that doesn't just mean be better and prep more and like all those things that you would hope you overall try to do in general. It's about pushing yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit. Once you have the skill to do it, then you have the necessity, I think, to do some of that, not just because it keeps your work fresh, but because we're stretching all of us then as human beings by exploring these things.
yeah.
So what about you? Have you had a campaign like that?
Yeah, I mean, lightheartedly first, I'll mention that the very first professional campaign that I ran was set in Ravnica, which is a Magic the Gathering setting.
Yep.
One of my favorite, well, actually, yeah, my
It is your
I
favorite,
would say,
right?
yeah, my favorite setting. Aside from, I don't like to pick singular favorites, but if I had to, I'd pick Ravnica probably. Um, for almost near the entirety of that campaign. Oh yeah, I just remembered another cool part of it. Almost the entirety of that campaign, two of my players are twins in real life, identical twins
Oh,
that
wild.
that look very much the same, sound very much the same. One of them is actually named Zach in real life too, so we had some confusing moments where he'd say Zach and his twin
Is a
and I would look,
Spider-Man like
yeah,
me?
we'd
Yep.
Spider-Man point. But that campaign, that Ravnica campaign, ran for I think around 42 sessions or something before we
Mhm.
closed it out. And at first, it was actually just Matt. His character's name was Mac, so I always get them confused. I sometimes
Okay.
called him his character's name, but it was just Matt for a while. But then he was like, "Yeah, I have a twin who I'm gonna make my elf character in game have a twin brother just like me in real life." And so for a while in the beginning of the campaign, when his twin brother finally arrived, which in the story they were estranged, I was an NPC playing his character's twin brother.
Oh,
And then
wow.
eventually his actual twin brother came, tried out the campaign with us, and for basically the second half of the campaign, joined us to the end. And he played that NPC version of himself that he then took over.
That's like,
Um,
wow.
and I got to run as we neared the end. Our campaign, what sort of led me to believe it was starting to come to a close was, of course, scheduling stuff. One of our other players had just had a kid too, and so he was like, my schedule is going to entirely change, and he's also changing jobs. He works at a startup, so it's like, okay, it looks like it's time. So as we neared the end, I did a series of solo sessions with people, and I think with the twins, I only did two, but the two that I did, it was just them, and so what a window into like them as people, as
Yeah.
twins, and then
Yeah.
them playing twins in the game and running. Anyway, that's not even the dynamic that came to mind that I thought I'd mention, but that was just very interesting. Like working
That
with
is cool.
people that already in D&D, we play with our friends a lot, and so that dynamic of knowing the players at the table as people first is
Mhm.
always there and
Mhm.
helpful, but then also to just like that interesting dynamic of them being twins and brothers, and that bit of friendly competition between them, and then also me as the DM who I choose to shine the spotlight on when. And anyway, the part of the reason why I asked that question though is very recently, as in yesterday, when I was running another professional campaign, I my characters, my players were fighting an aboleth, and we're trying to stop a ritual in a room where a dragon of red and blue mana was being sapped of its magic to fuel essentially like an arcane tornado that was going to tear the world apart.
No.
Usual D&D stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Not low stakes, right?
yeah. So while the dragon was being there was an element of like, stop the ritual, but also there's an aboleth in the same room trying to stop you. And so,
Yeah.
big combat. We basically spent the entire session in combat. And it was fun. It was great. And I think I'm one of the epiphanies that I'm reaching as far as, interesting player dynamics is that uh, as we've established, combat can take very, very long and oftentimes just turns into, okay, I rolled a hit. All right, I hit. All right, that's 2d10 damage. Okay. All right, pass turn.
Hmm.
And so I took a moment yesterday. One of the player characters went down to 0 HP, and another player character was like, okay, I was gonna say something else and do a different action this turn, but it's more important, like I want to get my friend up, so I'm gonna cast healing word, and that's my turn.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, wait, what's your, I usually ask people when they cast healing word, what's your healing word? But I felt like we were kind of in that slog of combat for a while, so I asked her, not only what is your healing word, but like how is your character feeling in this exact moment,
Uh,
all these dynamics. And it led to like a 10-minute sidebar of like in the Assassin's Creed games when you assassinate one of the major characters and then you
there's like
have
this
the
pause and
moment
they're just talking to
yeah,
each
they're
other.
just
Yeah.
talking to each other for
Yep.
10 minutes. We had one of those, but it was a single healing word cast in the middle of combat to bring someone back to consciousness. So not only did I have that player suddenly sort of blossomed forth this beautiful introspection about how their character felt in that moment, but then also I gave a vision to the character that was unconscious getting revived. So anyway, this is that what I got to see then too is an unusual union between those two characters in that moment, because it was that character healing that other character.
Right.
And so me prompting her to be like, how does your character feel about this, led to a role play moment between them that happened in combat. So anyway, yeah, that has just been on my mind. I don't even remember exactly what was said between the characters, but it was just sort of a moment where they were sharing, the character who was doing the reviving was sharing their feelings not only towards the combat but also about the character they were reviving, which
Hmm.
had never been spoken because it didn't naturally come up. But of course it naturally comes up when your person's unconscious in front of you and you're fighting an aboleth. So um yeah, I guess it just reminded me like the that sort of spirit of D&D is like, yes, it's an entertaining game, and that the entertaining part comes from the combat for
Right.
sure, but I think we need to not forget to lose that challenging humanity part, or that moral and ethical dilemma part of, even in combat, why are we fighting, and what's going on there. So
Well, right, because I mean, the other thing is that it creates, right, it creates stakes for that combat. It
right,
makes the combat matter. Like, you don't fight the combat for the sake of itself, although some people like, just the mechanical aspect of that. You fight the combat in part to resolve the things that were brought up during the role play part, during the
right,
part that really makes it into something that's not just it's the fighting by itself, the rolling dice by itself, what a lot of people refer to as sort of the dungeon crawl, the old school dungeon crawl. I mean, that can have some kind of mechanical interest, but frankly, there's probably better games if you're looking for games that have like
yeah,
fast-paced fighting where you really have lots of different options and styles. Like, there are probably other games that might be better suited, for you if you wanted to do just that. It's the fact that Dungeons and Dragons understands, I think, has always understood pace, and how you pace the revelations of moments that matter to the characters, so that the characters' combat matters because the role play sections mattered. So I love the idea that you were able to pause it for a few seconds or
yeah,
a few minutes even, and we had this conversation in the middle of combat, and you could say like, well, it's only 6 seconds, and like it's not really, but truthfully,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
time is elastic anyway, right? Like we go through these moments. My life flashed before my eyes. We hear these phrases all the time. You hit snooze on your alarm clock, and in the 9 minutes that the clock is waiting to,
You have an
go back on,
entire dream.
you have this like epic dream that lasts for two
Yeah,
centuries or whatever,
yeah,
right? So our sense of time is elastic anyway. So it's totally reasonable then to have a conversation like that happening in combat, where the stakes are raised by the nature of the physical sort of confrontation, but also the implications of it come from what the people think of outside of it. They fight to preserve this city, they fight to
yeah,
preserve their lifestyle, they fight to preserve their family, they fight to, in more negative ways, to strike back against others, they fight to get revenge on others. But the point is, it's the in between combat moments that provide stakes and authority for the combat moments. And that's one of the reasons that it's satisfying, is when you're like, and I got this bastard because of what this bastard did to me in blah 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 with my family and my backstory and blah 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 blah. So like those moments are hugely important. And yeah, I wonder a little bit if there isn't some of that sense of the chemistry between the players, but also this sense of stakes that get raised based upon the role play that's been done, which really affects everything else. It makes the combat far better, far more meaningful, far more satisfying when you can be like, I took down this person who has ruined my life for 4 levels or whatever. I
yeah.
took them down in this combat. Guarantee that's going to be more satisfying than just some, run of the mill, variety criminal like jumps out of the shadows to try to shiv you in an alley.
Right.
That's a whole different thing.
Yeah. It brings me back to last episode. I brought up an aphorism that you had mentioned during a session. And of course, our good friend Carlos Hernandez once said during an Esper Genesis game, I think during an Esper Genesis game, the wounds hurt more because of the role play. The healing matters more because of the role play.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a quote that I have down.
100%, 100% right. And I've always believed that, even as I look at how that works within a session, but even across an entire campaign, how people feel the impact of it based upon something that happened to them at level 3. They feel the
Yeah,
impact of that when they have a chance to do something about it in level 12 or whatever. So
yeah,
it really does make a difference.
that's cool.
Um, I think so. You've got one for me, and I got one for you, or you asked me one, so I've got one for you, and
Yeah,
you got
no,
one for me, I guess.
yeah, I think.
Okay. So the second one and last one for me for tonight is,
Hmm.
um, so I have been thinking quite a bit about the concept of this sort of GM-less concept versus GM-driven concept. A lot of games that play around with this idea of, you don't need a GM for this. You can role play on your own, you can do stuff on your own. There's a big discussion about whether or not, that's gone on for a long time, about whether or not you need dungeon masters or game masters to sort of make the tabletop sing, or whether you could just do it as a group, kind of collectively, narratively, without any one person being in charge. Obviously, this partially depends on the system, but I'm curious, um, how would you classify how much is your interest, I guess, in terms of GM directed versus broadly collaborative? And these things are obviously vague on purpose. So broadly collaborative may have some person who's nominally at least the GM, and GM driven may have a fair bit of sort of collaborative aspect to it in some way, but still they seem like sort of separate things. So what's your feeling on the GM-less game? Or would you prefer to stay with a sort of GM or DM driven type of system?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is video games are. I was going to say that video games are kind of GM-less, but even in that case, I don't think that's true, because technically the writers of the video game and the themes that they've put in the game that you're sitting down to play, you're the player, the game is the GM.
Yeah, really.
So I think in terms of RPGs, if we're talking literally, like, here's a module for one player where you sit down and you play it and it's GM-less,
Right.
for that, the going back to the classic choose your own adventure games, I mean, that applies to the video game example too, I suppose too, of like technically it's not GMless. It's still the content of whoever prepared that for you. That's the GM really. So I'd say though, as far as the more esoteric idea of a two different D&D tables where one is the classic D&D table with one dungeon master who has
Right.
prepared a module with 5 players
Right.
versus this other idea of a D&D table where I think D&D actually has this optional mechanic called uh like plot points where characters can interject and use their plot point to literally change the plot or like
Yeah.
change the dynamic of the story so that
Yeah.
instead of the or actually they can claim GM-hood for a certain period of time before then another player becomes the dungeon master in the
Right.
same session. I've never really done any of those more open or like you said, open collaborative styles. I think what the examples I just gave are the extreme of that, where it's like every player can be the GM at a determined point in time.
Right.
But I don't know. I think there's something to be said about a one person coming to the table and something having something prepared for the environment and the setting. I think in the same way that books only have one author usually that describes the setting and the geography, but then there's multiple characters. Like I think every player that comes to a D&D table comes with something that they've prepared. If you're the DM, that's the environment, the story, the monsters, whatever. But if you're a player, that's your backstory, your player's perspective or your character's perspective, their dynamic, their character sheet, their abilities. I think I like that dynamic of one person. I think Matt Mercer once put it as the DM of a D&D campaign, them DMing is a gift to the players. Like they
Yeah.
are in a way they're preparing something and a theme or a story that they want to explore, like choosing to do Curse of Strahd as a group and then also that GM running it is a deliberate choice to explore horror but also to explore, having a villain that is full of himself or and
Right.
also that dynamic of vengeance on werewolves and everything that so I don't know. I like the more classic sense of one person having a story that they want to tell and then bringing the other players to explore that story. I mean, we have the same thing in movies. Speaking of Barbenheimer and watching Killian Murphy and Margot Robbie talk to each other about their movies, Christopher Nolan has come up a lot. And a lot of the time, it sounds like from these actors that have worked with him that Christopher Nolan has an idea for a movie, and he's like, "All right, we're gonna do it. We're gonna make Oppenheimer." And then he calls up Killian Murphy, and he's like, "Hey, I want you to be the main actor for it." And Killian Murphy's like, "Okay." And he just assembles a team,
Yep.
and they're all on board for Christopher Nolan's campaign, Oppenheimer, and they're all the players. And I think then we end up with Oppenheimer, the movie. So I think would that movie, to stick with the example, be the same if Christopher Nolan, Killian Murphy, and the rest of the cast all got together and they were like, "What do you want to do? What do you want to do? What do you want to do? Let's all do it all at once and just kind of riff off of each other and see where it goes."
Right.
That movie would be very unique, but probably a lot worse, I think, in my view. So I think you need someone who is there to be an arbiter between the characters, between the players, to be a maintainer of theme and
Hmm.
setting and story. So that then, almost, I guess, in the same sense, I guess I'll conclude by saying that it's the same sense when people say having creativity with no limits is actually worse than creativity within a box, within a certain set of parameters. And I think that the DM is there to provide those certain set of parameters. And there can be value from, people riffing off of each other's ideas of in the moment, like, oh, what if someone showed up here at this point in Curse of Strahd and then they start DMing it. But yeah, I think my opinion is I don't have a lot of experience in those sort of shared or co-DMing spaces, but I'd like to try them. But I definitely recognize the value of what we have been doing, which is that classic sense of one person coming in and sort of controlling the world and the players controlling their part.
Would you feel similar about, like, say, the co-DM model, where you have basically either rotating or you have, two people and they become essentially co-DMs?
Yeah, I think it's a sliding scale wherein one DM is is one side of the extreme and everyone at the table is the DM is the other side of the extreme. Two DMs just starts to slide a little bit towards
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
side.
Yeah.
Obviously, when you have, you know, that's why we have the phrase "too many cooks in the kitchen." It's like with the right person and the right idea. I think even still, like you just adding one person, you still need to agree on so many different things, so that then those two people know what the boundaries are for the creativity that's going to happen. So
Right. Right.
um, I did. I have co-DM'd a couple times, um, and sometimes traditionally those roles divide into like this person is actually is doing most of the work or doing most of the prep and things, but then this person's handling combat or this person's handling player interactions or rules questions.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, co-DMing is great, and I also don't have too much experience with that, but um, yeah, it's closer on the sliding scale to a single DM than it is to everyone at the table being one. But
That's funny.
what's your experience with sort of those more open gameplay styles and kind of the intent behind your question?
Yeah, there's on the one hand, the sort of pure collaborative approach, I think is very interesting because it's sort of a kind of dynamic storytelling model that theoretically can provide a great deal more interest and value than just sort of the single GM narrated or author narrated, if you will, kind of story that feels like it's just sort of pushing people down one path. So I like the idea of this full aspect of collaboration. In fact, I have back here, there's a game called Cosmic Patrol, from I think Catalyst, which makes as its like biggest virtue the fact that it is GMless and it's everyone working together. And
Mm,
in even in that game, there's a sense of like certain things that are sort of have to be decided by one person, and they rotate that person over the course of the game. But it still felt like at the end I was kind of coming back to the same sort of uh I don't know, model where I was kind of like, what's the story that we're telling, and like who's
right,
telling it and who's responsible.
right.
um so I think so I both I liked the Cosmic Patrol approach, but I don't know what that I'd want that as a steady diet. Part of it is that yes, you want people to be telling their own, like to have their own voices heard within the story that's being told. And so railroading, right, where you push as a DM, you push everybody down one particular path, that's not good because it means that people feel like they're just sort of bit players in this cast list of a play
Right.
that they didn't write and they don't really care about. And it's not really their business and everything else. So you want to invest, them in it, partly by letting their choices matter. But I actually think paradoxically that if you do it properly, it's easier to let a player's choices matter when there's one of you and several of them. Why?
Mm,
Because it's very hard for players to balance off against each other what things in their backstories, what things in their experience are going to matter most to them at a given moment, especially when those things come into conflict. If you think about, for example, the difference between a college and a university in the university setting. So you have a university and you have lots of colleges within that university setting. That's what makes it a university, who have their own deans, who have their own faculty, who have their own class structures, who have their own approaches in terms of what's required. And
mm,
they, because the university establishes this, they have their own, majors and things like that that they focus on.
mm,
But those are specific to the college, right? My college that I teach at is going to have particular needs and desires that will be different from the specific straight up liberal arts college on my campus, or the business school, or the pharmacy school, or whatever else. How do we overcome all of that? by having a university and a provost and a president that can kind of see the big picture and can not so much referee, I don't want to put it that way, but can at the very least sort of have this common vision. And so I think that actually a DM who knows the backstories of these characters that they may not be willing to tell each other, right? They might not be
Mm,
willing to say, well, this happened to me when I was 3, and this happened to me when I was 12, and this happened to me when I was 30. Like that can all come in and be part and parcel of the stuff you pass to the DM, because you as a player know that there is a guarantee that the DM will maintain and keep that information safe. And now it's up to the DM to decide what point in the story bringing back in that secret long lost NPC, or the person that the six-figured man that killed Inigo
yeah,
Montoya's father. Like
yeah,
whenever that moment happens to come, it's able to come because that voice, that sort of presence could see where all of these things were going to fit in, and therefore could make it more interesting. So I mean, I just think there's a lot of focus on the sort of collaborative, no one has to be a GM thing, everyone is the GM thing. I think it's very democratic in principle, and I understand why it's done. But I think from a gameplay experience, it's not something that I would want as a steady diet, precisely because you want some authority to exist, and you especially want some big picture thinking, which is much
yeah,
harder to do when you have people playing their own individual relatively smaller characters.
yeah. The big picture thinking, in the sense too that, like, if you imagine the story as a, I don't know, a rope that six people have a grip of, and with one DM, that one person is the one that's tugging the rope and leading the way. But
Right.
then with six potential DMs at any given moment, all following each other's whims, then that rope gets tugged every which way, and sometimes it does lead in a cool new direction, and you can riff off of each other. I mean, that's that improvisational aspect. Then also too, maybe you don't get the sense of where that person's leading, and then when it's your turn, you lead out of what they were thinking, and then you lead back, and then so yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think the aspect of a DM having that bigger picture idea of backstories and players, I think it's also a question too of responsibility, where the responsibilities are clear between players and DM,
Right.
where if everyone is a DM at the table, that's actually two hats, and that every person would have to wear.
And not everybody is capable of ceding like authority when they're supposed to, not because they're power hungry, but because they don't even know how. If you've been given the authority of a GM and you know how to be like, I can control the narrative in this way, I can decide when the NPC makes their appearance, I can talk about what the environmental conditions of this particular place that you're in are. Like, you have all of this authority and power that you get as a GM. But when you're a single GM, you're aware of that power, it seems to me. Like, that it exists. If you're any good at it, that you're going to have to be consciously aware of it. And I'm not sure that happens when you have sort of the everyone's a GM model, because then the assumption is, well, who do you cede authority to at a given moment? How do you work through, difficulties where two characters are fundamentally opposed? How do you do that? How do you understand all of that if you are yourself directly invested on the player level with those other people? It's not easy to do that, and that's where the DM or GM's job comes in, to be able to see that big picture and to be able to know when to implement various aspects of it in a way that I don't know that other methods are able to do ultimately.
Yeah, great. Well, uh, I have many other questions, but last time we did three. This time we did three.
Okay.
So I think that'll be it. And at least for now. And everyone will see us in our next episode, whenever that will be.
Yes.
And
Coming soon to a
coming
YouTube near you.
soon too.
And thanks everyone for watching us as well. And
And listening
please,
too.
and listening, and please spread the word. Tell your friends. Let them know.
Thanks. All right. See
Bye.
you guys next time.